Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ryan Fitzpatrick. I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Program at Third Way. And first of all, thank you all for joining us for today's program. We'll be talking about making the most of our electric vehicle investments. The global car market is quickly moving away from gas-powered vehicles and toward EVs. And we've seen dozens of automakers revealing new electric models in the past year. We've seen EV sales doubled in the US between 2020 and 2021. And manufacturers are continuing to expand their domestic operations. This surge in EVs is remarkable. But other countries have been taking huge steps to accelerate their production and adoption of EVs as well. So if the United States doesn't stay ahead of the curve, we're going to miss out on some opportunities to lead this industry, to protect and grow our jobs here at home in the auto sector, and to rapidly deliver affordable EV options to American consumers that save them money, that help them blunt the impact of global spikes in energy prices and what that does to their wallets, and that can cut pollution in their communities. The bipartisan infrastructure law, as many of us know, it provides some critical investments to help build out our EV industry. And this includes $7.5 billion for alternative vehicle refueling, and at least $5 billion of that is going to go toward EV charging infrastructure. It also provides $6 billion in grants for processing and manufacturing for batteries. And that's going to help us build a domestic supply chain for these vehicles. This is a huge win. Now, how do we get the most out of these investments for American workers and American consumers? How can we foster the strong collaboration we need between utilities, state planning agencies, and private companies to successfully build out a national EV charging network? How do we integrate equity when we're deploying this funding and ensure underserved and rural communities aren't left behind as our country is making this shift toward EVs? And at the same time, we know that there is still further support needed from the federal government to scale up EV manufacturing, supply chains, and consumer uptake. So what sort of additional policy, such as EV purchase incentives and additional RD&D funding, do we still need to support our transition to EVs and ensure that American manufacturers and workers are leaders in this space? So I'm asking a lot of questions, I understand, and luckily we have a really good lineup of experts who are going to speak to us today to help answer some of those questions. We're going to start with a conversation between Michael Baraby, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sustainable Transportation at the U.S. Department of Energy, and Dr. Ellen Hughes-Cromwick here with me. She is Third Way's Senior Resident Fellow and the former Chief Economist at Ford Motor Company. Then our colleague Alex Laska will talk with a panel of transportation experts about how we can build a resilient and competitive EV industry in the United States and ensure every American is able to participate in that. We're going to save some time at the end for audience Q&A, and you'll be able to submit your questions for panelists using the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, I want to thank you one more time for joining us today and welcome my colleague Ellen Hughes-Cromwick to get us started. Ellen, take it away.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate you joining this great event today. I would like to first welcome Michael Baraby, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Sustainable Transportation in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy. Now, Michael leads the DOE's transportation research, development, demonstration, and deployment team focused on decarbonizing the transportation sector, from cars to heavy trucks to airplanes. This includes vehicles, batteries, hydrogen fuel cells, and bioenergy, as well as how electric vehicles and hydrogen can help support the transition to clean energy. He created the DOE's mobility research program focused on new mobility solutions, including connected and automated vehicles, transit, e-commerce, and ride sharing. He has over 20 years experience as a senior executive in the auto industry and has worked closely across the government with the US Department of Transportation and EPA over his career. And here's the kicker, you know, he left the private sector and joined government because he believes in public service and that ambitious goals cannot be achieved without harnessing the power of the private sector guided by smart public policy. You know, Michael, there's a phrase at the top of the Department of Commerce building on the outside that is very much in that swim lane that you mentioned in your bio. So thanks so much for joining us. You know, there have been some really exciting developments Ryan alluded to regarding the transition to EVs. And we've seen the private sector investment really accelerate in the last 2 years, with major automakers dedicating, you know, tens of billions of dollars to the production and sale of EVs. As Ryan mentioned, the bipartisan infrastructure law includes substantial support for charging infrastructure in batteries. I was hoping you could kick off by talking a little bit about these provisions in the law and how you see these funds being deployed in the next 5 years.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for that great introduction. You flatter me, I think. So I'm really glad to be here and join the group. Yeah, I think that as you alluded to, it maybe was one of the things I wanted to comment on. You know, I've been in the automotive industry for a long time, as you said, and working out with DOE for about 5.5 years. And I am still actually amazed each week now at the scope and level of announcements and commitment across the transportation sector. And you know, a lot of attention certainly on light duty vehicles and electrification, but really beyond that. And I know I have a little bit closer lens maybe than many people, but heavy duty trucks, aviation, rail, shipping. There is really a tremendous push across all those spaces, and it's needed, quite honestly. It's critically important. The timeline we are on, really set by the climate crisis, is that we have to be in the throes of deploying now in order to really hit the goals of having close to full deployment by 2035 across all of those modes, if we want to hit a economy-wide decarbonization and transportation by 2050. So let me just touch on, as you said, the infrastructure bill is game-changing, and it really, you know, there was a strategy there among all the people working on that, from the agencies, administration, and Congress, recognizing the need in transportation. So maybe to hit me 3 really big areas. Brian mentioned first EV charging. There needs to be a big push, and there is, with $7.5 billion in the infrastructure law for deploying a national EV infrastructure. With those funds, we will be able to, we being, you know, DOT and DOE working jointly with the new joint office that's been set up between the offices, between the agencies, we will be able to deploy a truly national network, coast to coast, fast charging, to allow for those long distance trips that people get concerned about if they want to buy an EV. But there's also funds in there for community-based charging, and in cities and in communities, both rural and urban, both, for more of that day-to-day charging, and to help address those people that don't have access to electricity where they park their car today. Now, those funds will not cover everything we need on charging by any stretch. There's a lot of private investment, state investment on top of that will be needed. But this really will be a major, major down payment to accelerate the move and really to match the announcements you've seen and the commercials you've seen, you know, about new EVs. That's, you know, one huge new push. Related to that, and in concert, is on the other end of the spectrum, a big effort in the infrastructure bill $6.5 billion on batteries to develop a domestic battery supply chain from the raw materials all the way through to the cell production and the recycling of batteries, because those recycled batteries can actually make up 40% of the raw materials and be one of the most cost competitive sources of the raw materials for future batteries. So that will be a big push as well. So that is money that we published a notice of intent for the funding opportunity just a few weeks ago out of DOE for the first phase of those funds. And then the last piece I want to touch on is close to $8 billion that we put a request for information RFI out that really lays out some of our thinking that we're asking for comment on of a hydrogen infrastructure plan through a series of hydrogen hubs. So think of these as a number of regional hubs around the country that focus on demonstrating the full production of hydrogen, the transportation, the storage, the use. Some of that's in transportation, some of that use will be in energy storage to help move to a grid that is 100% renewable. And the sources of hydrogen is to demo different potential sources of how you make the hydrogen as well. But this will give us a jump start in the US really on how do we test and develop how to have that hydrogen economy that we think has a lot of potential applications for decarbonizing industry, for the grid, and for heavy duty trucks in the transportation sector. So let me pause there because I'm sure you've got other questions. There's certainly more we could talk about.
Yeah. No, I would like to follow up on that because the DOE just released a study this week on medium and heavy duty truck electrification, as well as hydrogen fuel cell trucks. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the findings in that report.
Yeah, no, this was, I think, really interesting. We have been working for a number of years now with medium and heavy duty truck makers on the opportunities to electrify both battery and hydrogen. And I will say 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism about could you electrify these vehicles? I mean, and today that is really flipped around. So we did an updated study looking at the current and really realistic future costs for batteries and hydrogen, the time it takes to refuel or recharge, the life cycle operating costs. And when you use realistic payback assumptions and you look at what is the total operating cost as these businesses do, what we found is that by 2030, almost 50% of trucks, it will be cheaper to have to buy and own and operate the electric truck versus today's incumbent gasoline or diesel. And by 2035, that expands to almost the entire truck fleet. Now that 2035 does require we hit our goals on hydrogen and battery fuel cells by that time. But we have a lot of R&D effort there that has progressed quite well, and we think we will be able to hit those goals. But even by 2030, over half of trucks. Now, when we look at them, the first trucks that will make the most sense are the shorter range trucks. So those could include class 7 and 8 short haul trucks, which make up a pretty good number of those trucks. And certainly the smaller delivery van type vehicles, often a large class 3, 4, 5, 6 truck. So I think one of the interesting things here is the truck market is different than the retail market, right? These are business vehicles, commercial vehicles. When you get to a point that total cost of ownership is cheaper for a business, that's the number one driver, right? So you will see, we believe, a pretty quick flip in people's interest in those vehicles, which poses a challenge because unlike light duty, where the charging infrastructure can kind of grow each year as the vehicles start growing, in the truck space, you might see a much quicker flip over. So we need to start in that. And the charging, of course, takes more work, whether you're talking about electric charging or the fueling for hydrogen. So we think that right now we need to start working aggressively, industry, utilities, PUCs, DOE, on developing that refueling infrastructure for the truck side so that we're ready come 2026, 2027, when you start seeing this flip over in the volume.
It's a complicated formula. There's so many different elements that are important. You mentioned the battery cost and infrastructure. I guess I just want to turn now, if we could, for a minute, because you've been a leader in this area of, R&D, D&D efforts, we've got ARPA-E, which is supporting, innovations around new battery chemistries. Do you have the funding at DOE necessary to achieve breakthroughs in some of these key areas and improve the charging infrastructure, technology? Do you feel like there's enough support for the research being done, the R&D, D&D?
Certainly I think when you break that apart, the infrastructure bill focuses on that demonstration and deployment. And that, if you go back over the last 10 years in the transportation space, a lot of our emphasis has been more primarily, not completely, but on the R&D, research and development, developing batteries that work, that get the cost down, getting hydrogen costs down, fuel cell durability up. And we should definitely talk about biofuels in here in aviation, right? The cost actually of biofuels, low greenhouse gas biofuels, have come down a lot. Actually, they have dropped as much from a percent basis as battery costs have, which is interesting. And we're still not quite where we need to be. But so we've done a lot of that work. We now need the demonstration and deployment, which is what the infrastructure bill really helps give us, which we believe helps get the volume up, will further bring costs down and get the experience. But we're not done on the R&D. We just got congressional reports on the 22 budget, which really provides substantial funds on R&D to continue on the battery side, continue on the hydrogen fuel cell, which also had a lot of funding in the infrastructure bill to work on hydrogen production costs. Hydrogen is not as far along as batteries, right? They've moved a lot, but we need another big push, and I think the infrastructure bill will provide it. I think one area that we need to all work on is on biofuels. Biofuels have a huge opportunity, and aviation is one of the biggest growing pieces of transportation. When you look globally, it is a huge piece of the emissions pie. And to really decarbonize aviation, we are going to need sustainable aviation fuels. We have a big commitment by the airline industry and the government through the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Challenge to get to 10% of all the fuel in all the airplanes in the US to be sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. But we're going to need a sustained push by industry, by the investment community, and by government collectively on the sustainable aviation fuel to kind of get the demonstration and deployment up there. So that is, I would say, one of the big priorities looking forward that collectively we all have to work on.
That's great. If there are any fans out there of PTI, this feels a little bit like the lightning round. I know our time is coming to a close. Let me just ask you a final, question. There were purchase incentives for EVs in the Build Back Better Act. They're kind of hanging in the balance. How do you think, that piece of legislation could possibly get us to the president's target of 50% EV penetration by 2030? And, we seem to be uncompetitive in some areas around EVs compared to, what's happening in China, in Europe. Do you see this coming together in getting to a point where, we could really achieve that target that President Biden has laid out?
Look, I believe we are going to hit that target. I think we'll hit the 50% and it'll continue to grow from there. Having on light duty vehicles, having the tax incentives, light duty vehicles, but also medium and heavy duty. There was also sustainable aviation fuel and hydrogen production tax credits in there. Those are also critically important to achieve the goals as well. Europe hit 20% of their new car sales as electric vehicles last year, 20%. And that was the full year. They were like trending higher than that. And they are providing, incentives along the way there. So certainly I think we support those incentives that for the Build Back Better bill, however they can come to fruition. And they will definitely help a lot in getting to those goals. But I think the bottom line is we are committed to get there one way or the other, and we've got to do that. But those incentives certainly would be a helpful piece.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for the great discussion. Thank you for your leadership and significant contributions you're making to this transition toward sustainable transportation. Well, I'd like to turn over the mic to Alex Laska, our Senior Transportation Advisor, who will introduce and moderate our expert panel discussion. Alex?
Great, thanks so much, Ellen, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Alex Laska. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for Transportation at Third Way's Climate and Energy Program. I'm really excited to moderate our panel today, where we'll be talking about how we can make the most of these new federal investments in electric vehicles so we can not only meet our climate goals, but also make sure that America's automakers, our manufacturers, our workers can lead the global transition to EVs. And of course, we want to make sure that every American can benefit fully from this transition. And as a reminder, we will be taking audience questions at the end of our discussion. So please feel free to submit any questions you have for our panelists using Zoom's Q&A function. So now I'm joined by three experts who will talk to us about how we can maximize the opportunities we have for electrified transportation, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as what more is needed to accelerate our efforts to electrify. I'm joined first by Heather Foster, who is the Senior Director for National Policy Engagement at Lyft. I'm also joined by Julia Reege, who is the Vice President for Energy and Environment at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And finally, we have Eric Wood, who is a research engineer at the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So thanks to all three of you for joining me today. And I want to start by talking about the bipartisan infrastructure law, because the federal government will be providing billions of dollars over the next few years for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for battery manufacturing, recycling, and mineral processing, all very important for building a domestic supply chain for EVs and EV components. Julia, from your perspective, what do these investments mean for our ability to accelerate our shift towards EVs and make sure that American automakers and auto workers really lead this global transition?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so maybe I'll just start real quickly with Auto Innovators and who we represent. So we are a trade association representing automakers that produce about 98% of the new light-duty vehicles sold in the US, as well as tier one suppliers and technology and mobility companies. And so our organization is doing a lot of work on the shift to electrification because we really see this as a critical piece of our industry's goals to decarbonize through 2050. The auto industry today represents over 10 million jobs in our nation and about 5% of our GDP. So looking at how to build out electric vehicle capacity here in the US through the supply chain and manufacturing is really critical to not just our goals to continue to be innovators in the auto industry, but to making sure that we are continuing to support our nation's economy and the workforce. Auto Innovators last year released an electric vehicle innovation agenda where we outlined 3 key policy areas where we can all be working together to further promote electric vehicles. As part of that, we certainly see the need to be retooling and building manufacturing facilities, not just for the vehicles, but for the batteries, as well as domestic supplies of critical minerals. All of that has elements that are being supported by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and we think this is really important to growing that capacity in the US. And then ultimately, the ability to increase sales of electric vehicles in the US is also critical. And so the same dollars that Michael and Ellen were discussing that are going into EV charging infrastructure and hydrogen fueling stations are really important to supporting the customer when they buy an electric vehicle. And then of course, we also see incentives as a really critical piece of attracting new customers, as well as making sure that electric vehicles are affordable for everyone who's buying a vehicle.
Absolutely. And Heather, I'm interested in getting your thoughts on some of these things as well. I think these investments really present an opportunity for American businesses and for consumers. I'm curious what work you think needs to be done to communicate those opportunities and benefits associated with these investments, and anything else that might come down the pipe in terms of consumer incentives or anything else. And in particular, how do we make sure that people and businesses in historically underserved or disadvantaged communities are aware of these opportunities too? What does that engagement look like?
Well, thank you, Alex. At Lyft, we have been closely watching the legislation because we totally understand that, providing more opportunities so that people can switch to having EV electric vehicles is really important. As a company, we're really committed to this transition to making sure that communities have access. And so I do think that, seeing more communication about, for example, making sure that just EV charging stations are not just going along highways, but also making sure that they're in communities and that the education around using these charging stations will be available to people. I think it's going to be really important to share that information, and that way we will see some equitable opportunities where people will know, okay, this is where I can go and, charge my electric vehicle. And so we really think that communication is key if we are going to see this widespread EV adoption. I can tell you as a company, it's something we're very committed to. We're looking at making our platform 100% electric by 2030. And that is something that we've pledged to do publicly. And we're doing everything that we can, like I said, from educating, those who choose to drive on our platform, but also looking at opportunities within legislation to make sure that we can strengthen, point of sale rebates for people who are looking to purchase EVs. And as you mentioned, when we think about areas that are traditionally underserved, it's finding out where can, these charging stations be located in these communities. That way people will know, I can still purchase this vehicle and I can still have a way. I heard someone mentioning it earlier that, people often are very, concerned about, can I drive at certain distances, And so I think all of that education is going to be necessary, but also making sure that that communication is happening in the communities that we want to see these vehicles.
Absolutely. And Eric, since we're talking about EV charging right now, I want to ask you specifically about these new investments in EV charging. This is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. This is designed to help states build out fast charging along highway corridors predominantly. From your vantage point, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that come with this program? In other words, how do we make sure we're getting the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to this charging build out?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question, Alex. So a quick introduction. I'm a research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. NREL is the acronym there. And we're one of the national labs of the US Department of Energy. So work closely with Michael and his team as well. So, starting with the challenges, I think it's a great opportunity, right? There's a lot of potential demand out there for charging, but there's a balance that needs to happen when we think about deploying this infrastructure. So deploying the infrastructure too slowly has some obvious drawbacks. We don't want to stymie the vehicle market. We want to make sure that as more vehicles come online and hit the roads, that there are places for everyone to charge when they need it. But at the same time, we don't want to get the supply of infrastructure too far ahead of that demand for charging. That could result in low utilization for the network operators and make the business case for running a charging network more challenging. There's lots of evolving business models right now for what it looks like to run a charging network, but in some way, all of them tie back to utilization of that equipment. Other things to think about in this deployment are the mix of charging technologies that go on the ground. Of course, everyone, when they need to, is interested in being able to charge as fast as possible. But there are lots of opportunities for charging slowly, whether you're at home, you're at work, or you're out shopping and at a long duration location. There are opportunities for charging that is slower and perhaps more cost effective and at a lower price, which is part of the equitable access to EVs as we see it. And it's really important as well to think about the locations where these stations go in at, right? And so if you're going to deploy a slower AC level 2 charging station, having a good site host that has parking durations that are matched to the kind of charging technology that gets installed is important. Similarly, DC fast charging isn't necessary all the time and everywhere. There's a lot of people that are going to be able to charge their vehicles at home overnight. That's the location that we think is going to be the most affordable and convenient for most people. And so trying to think about the public network as a complement to the charging that people may do while they're at home is really important. Thinking about getting the most bang for your buck, I think the deployment needs to think about the speed of deployment. being able to efficiently install the infrastructure as well as the cost. So with charging scaling up, we would expect that economies of scale will help to bring down some of the hardware costs for these stations. But of course, as Michael stated, we need a strong supply chain to support that. It's a similar story, I think, for the installation of the stations as well. Scaling up the deployment will help the installers learn and develop best practices for installing the equipment efficiently. But at the same time, there's a potential for a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, to have been picked in terms of sites that are really low-cost sites for charging installation. We may see some increases as more distribution infrastructure for the electric grid needs to go in. And then soft costs are another big part of the equation as well. Having efficient permitting and utility interconnection is a big part of making these installations efficient and getting that bang for your buck. And so those are a lot of challenges, but I don't want to end on a down note. It's a huge opportunity, obviously, to decarbonize transportation, to rely more on domestic energy sources and relieve pressure on the volatile global oil market. And ultimately, we think it's an opportunity for a superior user experience, being able to refuel or charge your vehicle while you sleep, access to low-cost fuel, and great performance. These things are a kick in the pants to drive. And so we think a lot of people are going to be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julia, the private sector, of course, knows a thing or two about building out EV charging infrastructure by now. Automakers like General Motors and Ford, of course, but also so many other companies have been building out their own networks of EV charging stations. Can you talk about the importance of coordination between the public sector and the private sector so we can make sure that this new public funding for EV charging is complementary to the private sector build out that's already happening and not just duplicative?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So maybe there's two places I'll start here. And first is the auto industry investments that are going into electric vehicles. And so right now the auto industry has committed over $330 billion through 2025 to help roll out electric vehicles. And we're expecting to see about 130 models come to market in that time frame. Last year, we had just over 50 models available. So really looking at some pretty significant growth in the market for electric vehicles. The second piece of that is that more charging stations are needed. We need charging stations at home, at workplaces, in public spaces, and of course, along our highways and corridors, which is going to be so critical to supporting customers once they buy an electric vehicle. Obviously, everybody is looking at what is the right solution and the right way to roll out that technology. And there's funding from the government now at the federal level, there's state level funding, as well as these private sector investments. And I think coordination is just absolutely key to making sure that we have a plan to roll out the right amount of infrastructure to support all these great vehicles that are coming to market. One other piece that I would just point out is that as we build out the infrastructure, it's really important to make sure that we know what amount of infrastructure is going to be needed. And so, yes, there's all these different pieces that can be coordinated and pulled together, but I think we really need to see a good plan for the amount that's needed, where it needs to go, and then ultimately we will need innovative solutions as well as we take on some of the more challenging types of charging infrastructure, like those at multi-unit dwellings, and in some cases, making sure that we have the right amount of charging accessible and available to low-income communities as well. So really, that coordination needs to happen throughout government, state, federal and state, as well as with the private sector. And we really all need to be working together to support the goals of electrification, whether it's 50% by 2030 or looking beyond.
Absolutely. And Heather, I'm interested in getting your perspective on this, from the vantage point of a transportation network company. What are some of the important features in terms of making sure that this EV charging infrastructure is useful for TNCs like Lyft and for the people who drive on those platforms?
Yeah, so we've seen that, EVs are just in general a broader switch to low carbon transportation, right? That we know needs to happen across communities. And so for us, we really think that rideshare in particular, a part of our business, can help with this transition. Even the other day, I had a friend who, called a ride, and they took the ride in an electric vehicle, and it really opened their eyes to, oh, this is what this experience is like. It helped kind of break some of the things that they had initially thought about EVs away from them. And so we know giving people this experience is going to help them understand why it's so important and why, electrification is important. And so, we're continuing to do, more partnerships as we can, providing ways that those who choose to drive on our platform, they can take advantage of programs that we have where they are able to, rent an electric vehicle. And we've been working in a lot of different cities. Denver is one of those cities where we came in and we were able to, have an express drive, which basically allows drivers who choose to drive on the platform come rent an electric vehicle and use it for their services. And so that was I think a perfect opportunity of exposing it not only to our drivers, and then our drivers are able to expose it to the riders. And those are the type of programs that I think really helps us with this transition. As I mentioned before, we are transportation networks. So, we're also looking at micromobility in ways that we can continue to reduce the carbon footprint. But when we really look at electrification, that's why I think just the most recent bipartisan infrastructure investment bill was so important, and making sure that you can get out, that funding so we can continue to see additional partnerships in communities that will allow us to partner, as I mentioned, our drivers and also our riders in the electrification experience.
Absolutely. And as a follow-up to that, Heather, the Biden and Harris administration has made it clear that they want underserved and disadvantaged communities to receive at least 40% of the benefits of this build out as part of the Justice 40 initiative. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of making sure that those communities are included and benefit from that build out, and what that might look like. But also, what are the consequences if we fail to do that now that we have this opportunity?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think that's why we've been advocating so much with lawmakers about point of sale rebates and why it's so important. But also, as I mentioned before, I think making sure that where we're putting charging stations in an equitable way. For example, at Lyft, we've seen 73% of those who choose to drive on our platform are 73% are minorities. And so we know that, typically a lot of times there are ways that these are underserved communities, and we want to make sure that we're providing these resources. We've also noticed in the past recent year, 50% of our rides tend to happen in underserved communities. When you think about transportation and how people need to take it, particularly in this world that has become more and more fluid, people need to know that they have reliable transportation, so they know that they can call a Lyft ride to get somewhere. And so when we think about electrification, that's why it's so important and critical. Where are we putting charging stations, right? They cannot just be on highways. Also, what are we doing in terms of education? At Lyft, I mentioned our Express Drive program. It's a great opportunity to educate our drivers on how you would use an EV, how do you charge it? All of those things can happen at the centers. And so that's why we think the education is so important. From a policy standpoint, we're constantly talking to lawmakers, both national and locally, of how do we ensure that these charging stations are actually in areas where people feel like, okay, I can pull out of my garage, drive around the corner, and charge my car. And so that is one of the things that we're continuing to focus on this year.
Absolutely. Eric, you mentioned soft costs. I've seen studies suggesting that the siting and permitting of EV charging stations is a real major driver of cost, both in terms of money and time. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about more about that, and are there any lessons we can take from maybe the solar industry or the wind industry in terms of siting and permitting challenges, and how to sort of address those soft costs that we can apply to this EV charging build out we're about to see across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the significance of soft costs, it really just can't be overstated right now. we've seen that it's been a major barrier to the efficient deployment of infrastructure so far. And as you say, the time to deploy the stations, as well as the cost to deploy the stations, the prolonged permitting or interconnect process with the utility can really drive up the costs that the charging network sees to put these stations in the ground. So to be, good stewards of public funding, I think we really need to take a hard look at streamlining this process. But the challenge is that, we're dealing with literally thousands of local entities that have their own kind of unique permitting processes. And this creates a lot of challenge for the charging network companies because they don't always know what to expect when they go into a new area and start looking for permitting. There are inconsistent practices. Similarly, there's often not a primary point of contact with the local government on who reviews and approves EV charging permits. This is something that, as we scale up, we think it really needs to be a priority at the local level for people to get this familiarity with permitting charging stations and understand how to streamline the process. I think the solar industry is a great analog. It went through similar growing pains, about a decade ago with distributed PV. And NREL actually has taken a leading role in helping standardize national permitting processes for distributed solar installations, and are currently in talks with some of the charging network companies about what could be done in a similar manner on the charging infrastructure side. Could we establish national permitting best practices or processes that would allow the charging network companies to understand what's going to be required when they go into permit in a new location, and also relieve some of the burden on local entities that may not be familiar with EV charging. If you want to put in 2 level 2 AC charging units at a library, that's a very different kind of setup than if you're looking at a large megawatt level charging station for fast charging along a highway. And so some of these education pieces are going to be really important to help the network scale and quickly. And there's similar challenges on the utility side as well.
Got it. Now, question for Julia. We've been talking about EV charging and some of the other policies that are included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. What more, in your view, is needed? There have been talks, for example, and it's been mentioned a few times already at this event, of expanding the tax credit that helps American drivers purchase EVs, for example. What more can or should the federal government be doing to help the auto industry retool for EVs and make sure that these vehicles are affordable?
So there's really 3 areas that we've been focusing on as auto innovators, and those are infrastructure, incentives, and manufacturing and supply chain. And we really see those 3 areas as critical to supporting customers and really to growing electric vehicle sales across the US. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is really a great first step in taking on the infrastructure and manufacturing supply chain, providing money through grants, loans, and incentives to encourage additional development of our domestically sourced critical minerals, of looking at processing and manufacturing of those minerals, building out battery capacity, and ultimately making sure that we also have a recycling plan in place as well, so that we are reusing those minerals where we can. Those are really great first steps for helping to build out our EV capacity in the US, particularly since today, most of the capacity for building batteries is not in our nation. We also continue to support items like the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loans, which are included and expanded in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, because that helps provide dollars to encourage building out new facilities, retooling facilities, and again, making sure we're bringing that expertise into the US to build electric vehicles. Incentives are another really important component because we want customers to view the electric vehicles as affordable and convenient. And ultimately, right now, electric vehicles do remain at a higher price point compared to other technologies in the US. So incentives do continue to play a really important role. And then finally, on the infrastructure side, I think, again, we have a really great first step in down payment with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the $7.5 billion for corridor charging, as well as community-based based infrastructure, but that's just a first step. And so from our point of view, the ongoing efforts to coordinate industry, and when I say industry, I don't just mean the auto industry in this sense. I mean, we need utilities at the table, we need the EVSE providers at the table, we need the building industry at the table as well, because the most convenient and cost-effective way to roll out infrastructure is when something is being built or retrofitted, not after the cement is already poured. So we really just, the ongoing federal government efforts to bring everyone to the table for a robust dialogue is going to really pay dividends as we all plan for and work together to roll out more EVs in the US.
Absolutely. And Eric, I actually want to bounce this back to you because a few weeks or maybe a month ago at this point, the US Department of Transportation released guidance to help states plan how to use the new funding provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law for EV charging build out. And one thing that really stood out to me was the importance of collaboration, just as Julia said, between state DOTs and utilities, private companies building out, their own networks and many others. From your vantage point, how important is that collaboration and what might that look like?
Yeah, again, can't overstate the significance there of collaboration. I think we've touched on it a little bit already, but it's such a broad group of stakeholders that are stand to benefit from these investments and also making the investments themselves. We've run through the list, right? Autos, charging companies, utilities, state and local governments, and so coordinating those investments to have a good kind of complement of public and private investment is key, of course. Ultimately, though, even though investment is coming from a lot of different directions, at the end of the day, we want this to be a seamless experience for users and for drivers. And so, thinking about how we come to common agreement on standardizing payment, what signage looks like for these stations so that you can identify and quickly locate the station, and how the station shares data and communicates with the electric grid and with the auto companies as well. These are all really important pieces. And I think there's a big opportunity for the Joint Office to help establish some of those technical standards and ensure that kind of seamless experience for drivers. On top of everything that I just laid out, a big challenge remains, I think, to have consistent interoperability and reliability between the vehicle and the charging station. Some people might take it for granted today, but there's actually still a little bit of wiggle room in the standards here, where you will find in the real world there are many opportunities for charging that are not realized because of miscommunication in the technology between the charger and the vehicle itself. And so tightening those standards is going to be really important. Grid integration is another area where we need a lot of collaboration, right? So thinking about locating these stations in areas that are suitable and able to be served as load by the electric grid, and getting the utilities in the mindset of, there's a lot of vehicles potentially coming online, and how are they thinking about preparing to service that load? You'll find today that for large interconnect projects, for a high power fast charge station, you could be looking at months to even years in order to energize a station. And so to the idea of having efficient and fast deployment, those long interconnect periods are really going to slow things down and make everything less efficient. So getting the utilities really on board and excited about this idea of vehicle electrification is key. And many of them are, of course, but again, it's a very distributed system with thousands of electric utilities and co-ops across the country. And each of them is kind of at a different stage right now in terms of their sophistication and excitement about vehicle electrification.
Got it. And we're about to move into some audience Q&A here. And as a reminder, if folks have additional questions they want to ask our panelists, they can use the Q&A function on Zoom. But first, Heather, I want to ask you a question similar to what I had asked Julia previously, which is basically what more is needed? Lyft has committed to, as you said, having 100% of the vehicles on your platform be electric by 2030, which is a really inspiring and ambitious goal. So I'm curious, I guess really two things. First, what is Lyft doing internally to help enable that ambitious transition? But then also, are there any additional policies or incentives or assistance that is needed from the public sector to help TNCs like Lyft make that that faster drive towards zero emissions?
Yeah, so internally, as I mentioned, we are looking at our express drive rental program. And what we're doing as much as possible as we're looking to basically expand the types of cars there to really be EVs. And so we know, first of all, that's going to protect a lot of our drivers from the upfront costs of having an electric vehicle. It's going to increase access to those EVs in general. And then it really does boost the exposure and the awareness. Doing that is really key for us. Another big thing that we're doing is we're supporting a California ballot initiative called the Clean Cars and Clean Air Act. And this ballot initiative would make owning an EV affordable for millions of Californians, including many drivers who choose to drive with Lyft. And it would really, this, initiative is really going to expand the opportunity and really give more EV charging stations across the state. And we've seen a lot of excitement from environmental groups, labor and business leaders behind it. And so we really think this would be an important step to helping us achieve our goals. And lastly, we have been working a lot with the federal government. We're continuing to look at laws and ways that can just, once, as I mentioned before, this really point of sale rebate, I think will change the way that people approach buying a vehicle. If they know that it's going to be more affordable, they will be willing to do it. And so we know that if we can give the people who choose to drive more opportunities to purchase an EV, but as I mentioned, our express drive rental program, allowing them to rent a car for a certain time, that is really going to pave the way to us reaching this goal.
Got it. And so one question that's been coming in, and I think this sort of reflects public opinion pretty well, actually, is that, when it comes to what Americans want in an EV, they want to be able to charge quickly. They want to be able to drive longer distances between needing to charge. What work is being done in this space? And maybe I'll direct this first to you, Eric. What is NREL or DOE more broadly doing on encouraging or fostering this innovation around improving EV battery performance, improving charging times, things like that people can look forward to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the desire to have a long range vehicle that can charge quickly, it all comes back to the battery, right? So it turns out that we ask these electric vehicle batteries to do a lot of things, right? We want them to be low cost. We want them to have good energy density so that they can be small and lightweight for an efficient vehicle. We're asking them to accept really high charge rates and high currents so that you can get in and out of a charging station quickly when you need to. They need to be safe, of course. Safety is a critical piece, and we want them to be long lasting. These aren't components that we're expecting to swap out every 2 to 3 years. This is something that needs to last the life of the vehicle, thinking about 15, 20 years or longer. And then at the end of that life, we want to be able to reuse and recycle that battery. And so planning for the end of life now and how these batteries are going to be used 20 and 30 years from now is also a part of that. So that's a really high bar for an electrochemist. It turns out that if you only ask them to do 2 or 3 of those things, they can do that very well. But meeting all of those design requirements is really challenging. And as Michael laid out, there's a huge amount of investment going into the next generation of battery technology, including through the bipartisan infrastructure law and being administered by the Department of Energy. Some of those things include the public funds on the front end to help strengthen and establish supply chains, as well as on the back end for recycling capabilities. There's a long history, though, as well, within the Department of Energy and the Vehicle Technologies Office in pushing the envelope as far as what the next generation of automotive batteries can look like. So some of the topic areas that teams are working on include accelerating lithium metal battery R&D, including looking at solid state batteries, scaling up no cobalt and no nickel solutions for these electric vehicle battery cathodes, as well as expanding the ability to recycle the lithium at the end of life. And so a lot of public investment, a lot of private investment going into this space, and excited to see where it takes us in the coming years.
Great. And Julia, feel free to chime in if there's anything you want to say about that. I mean, innovation is in your name after all. I'm curious if any of the automakers or any of your members are doing interesting things on the innovation side to really sort of improve the the charging or the driving experience for folks looking at electric vehicles.
Yeah, in many ways, it's a re-emphasis of the points that Eric just made. I mean, it all comes down to the battery in so many ways, because the battery is the most expensive component on an electric vehicle today, and it is required to do a lot of things. And as we look at shifting the US market from about 4% sales of electric vehicles today into additional parts of the population, there will be more demands on that battery for its range, its convenience, its ability to charge quickly. And so, I mean, innovation is in our name, because the automakers are continually innovating, looking for the best way to roll out electric vehicles so that it's cost effective and meets the needs of our customers. And you know, it is about the vehicle. It is about the infrastructure then that supports the customer once they're in their vehicle. And it is also making sure that we have the capacity to produce those vehicles here in the US.
Great. We have, I think, time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. I'm going to read one that has come in from the audience. The question is, what technologies, tools, and techniques exist or are being developed to collect and analyze the data that will give you know, different entities, whether that's utilities or EV charging network providers, insight into where the lowest cost or right-sized opportunities for charging infrastructure deployment are? And as a sort of follow along to that, how are the Departments of Energy and Transportation working on developing tools like that and getting them out there to the people who could use them?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one on, Alex.
Great.
So at NREL, we maintain both data sets and modeling tools to take a look at what the charging networks of today look like, and to imagine and try to predict what's going to be necessary to support some of the goals that are out there, including the president's goal for 50% sales by 2030. So on the kind of backward-facing side, we maintain the alternative fuels data center station locator. So if you want to Google on your own, where are charging stations today, you're likely going to be taken to this DOE website, where behind the scenes, NREL is working with all of the charging networks across the country to collect data on where stations are located today. Are they slow charging stations, fast charging stations? How large are each of them, so that consumers have an idea of what's out there and are able to plan for long distance trips, from the comfort of their home, and know that they'll be reliably able to access charging on the way. And then forward looking, we also maintain a set of modeling capabilities that we call our Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Analysis Suite, or the EVIX suite. Again, if you Google NREL and EVIX, you'll likely find some resources there. But the whole idea is to think about how people are potentially going to use these vehicles, what levels of residential or home charging access might they have, and how much public charging is going to be necessary in order to support the use of those vehicles. And so we've for a long time worked with states like New York and California, as well as with the Department of Energy, to run analysis studies, and are currently working with the Joint Office to think about how we provide these tools as technical assistance to the states as they start developing their own plans for investment of the federal funds.
Great. Well, on that note, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us for a really great panel discussion. We really appreciate your expertise and your insights today. Thanks again to Deputy Assistant Secretary Baraby for joining us earlier. And thanks to all of you, the viewers, for tuning in. If you'd like to stay up to date on Third Way's work on electric vehicles and other climate and clean energy related issues, you can give us a follow on Twitter. We're at Third Way Energy. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.